Welcome to the Equipped for Life podcast. I'm Josh Brahm, and we're doing something kind of different today. We haven't put out any live audio or video out in quite a while. We used to do that a lot, and a lot of people really liked it. There's something kind of fun about a live, especially like a live Q&A like today's, because you never really know what's going to happen. What is the other person going to say? I had the opportunity to do a live Q&A recently that we are just making today's podcast. So I was going to explain kind of just real quick, like the context of this, and then we will get right into it. And so this took place at Fusion City Church in Kannapolis, North Carolina. They were doing a series on big questions. I know that they talked about like sexuality and gender stuff. And then the week prior to the week that I was there, they did a sermon on abortion. They kind of based everything on ERI materials. They've kind of fallen in love with ERI, and we love that. I really appreciate the pastors, the heart of the pastors of this church. And obviously we just really align, to the point that we were joking when I was there last Sunday that if I complimented the pro-life sermon he'd given the week before, is almost just patting ourselves on the back, because like a lot of there's like the equal rights arguments in there, and there's like a lot of Colossians 4:5-6, a lot of those things that we talk about were part of his sermon. And so if you are really into ERI, you might enjoy listening to that too. I'll link to it below. But then the following week, he has said, would be the Q&A kind of end of the series, and he had been taking questions from emails and texts and things like that. And most of the questions that he got in this series were on the abortion topic. And he invited me to sit in on that and basically field those questions. And so that's what I did. I thought it went really well. There's a couple of edits. So just kind of so you understand, I'll link to the full thing in case you want to watch the whole service, but I've cropped out obviously like the worship and announcements from the beginning. I've kept some of Pastor Brian's intro, but then I also did a cut. Shortly after I came on stage, he went ahead and answered one of the questions that he had received on transgenderism. I just cut that out just because that's not what ERI does. It's not an issue of whether or not, I agree or disagree with what Brian said. It's just not the topic that we're talking about. And so I just preferred to cut that. Again, if you want to go to the full video and go find what you're missing, you can do that. But for the sake of our audience, I'm kind of assuming that you were here for the parts that I was talking. And so I've pretty much just preserved the parts where I am taking questions from Brian. And if you've listened to ERI for a long time, then you're going to have heard some of these things before. I've got chapters on the YouTube video, and in the podcast notes, the show description, there will be chapters or time codes so you can skip around because there's some questions that we got into that I don't talk about that often, or I haven't talked about too often in public, and some for sure I have. So if you want to skip around to what you're most interested in, you can totally do that. So anyway, that's it. Without further ado, here is the Q&A service that I participated in recently at Fusion City Church.
And so with that in mind, I want to address some questions that came up during this series. But before I do that, I want to introduce to you a new friend of mine who I believe is becoming a very good friend of mine. This is Josh Brahm. Josh, if you would join me on stage. You guys give it up for Josh Brahm. Josh is with the Equal Rights Institute, and I think I told you guys, and I'll let him tell you a little more about himself, but I think I told you guys last week that, this chair's a little tricky, man, be careful.
Clearly.
Told you guys last week that Josh and his organization, the Equal Rights Institute, has dedicated their time and energy to helping those of us who are pro-life have better conversations. And so, Josh, will you tell us just a little bit about maybe how you got into that, how you get started, what was the drive behind the beginning or the genesis of Equal Rights Institute, and why you're so passionate?
Yeah, I knew I was going to be a pro-life speaker kind of since I was 11, which makes me an odd person to begin with. But like I was a homeschool kid, homeschooled my whole life, which is why I'm so socially awkward. And when I was 11, my dad took me to an abortion clinic with a group of guys from a church to pray. No one told me what abortion was, though. I hadn't even had the talk yet. I had no idea what was going on. And so later that day, I asked about it, and they kind of told me what abortion was. And I remember going through kind of these three emotions of feeling first surprised, because I was in a bubble. My church was super all about family and all that. And it's just like they didn't even want to do that. It was like kind of shocking to me. My cultural bubble got pierced, and then I felt really sad. And then I felt this kind of growing sense of, I guess I'm going to have to stop that when I grow up. So I started listening to pro-life speakers and reading pro-life books. And I was telling people as an 11-year-old, I was going to be a pro-life speaker when I grew up, and then I went and did that.
Very cool. Well, man, thank you so much for taking some time to be here with us today. Obviously, most of the questions that we received during the series were around the issue of abortion, and so we're going to get to those. I'll kind of back into those and let you do the heavy lifting when we get to those. But I wanted to address a couple of other questions that came in related to week one, and then just general conversation that I've had outside of the church wall, the Y walls. The second question that we received was actually from one of our students, which I was just really cool. She caught me in the parking lot. And Josh, this will actually kind of help us lead into the abortion conversation as well. But she wanted to know, does equal right to life apply when someone threatens your life? And so I think the example that she said was like if somebody were to pull a gun on you, right? At that moment, they're threatening, they've invaded they've threatened your equal right to life. Do they still have an equal right to life? And I'll say this about all rights, okay? All rights in general. That though we should and do have rights, we as reasonable, aware people have the option to forego our rights. And I think if you are an individual who threatens the life of another individual, you have chosen to forego your right to an equal right to life because you threatened another. And at that point, you've given up your right. I think about it this way. Like if you're ever arrested, right? If you're arrested, they read you your what? They read you your rights. And the first thing that they say is you have the right to remain silent. Now, I'm going to reveal something about myself that's a little maybe inappropriate. I listen to a lot of comedians. Not all of them are wholesome. I cannot recommend them to you because of some of the nature of the things that they say. But one of the gentlemen that I listened to that said something about this that has always stuck with me was Ron White. I am not endorsing anything that Ron White has to say. But in recounting one of his arrest stories, he said, at that point, I had the right to remain silent. What I did not have was the ability, right? We have the option to forego our rights. And in the case where one life threatens or risks another in that manner, a criminal act, I think that they have chosen to forego their right to life and gives them the opportunity there for a decision to be made on the part of the one who has been threatened to take theirs. And that's my position. Speaking of equal right to life, that's the best segue I got, Josh.
That's really good right there. It's almost like they were scripted.
One of the questions that I didn't have time to address last week in the abortion conversation was when a mother is faced with the choice of her life or the baby.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about abortion in the case of potentially saving the life of a mother, would that not be a justification for abortion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's one that pro-life people need to be a lot more clear about now. Like this year, more than I think any year prior, we need to be so clear about this because some of the legislation that's been debated in different states, now that states can choose what they want to do about abortion, there have been bills that have been drafted that weren't clear on this. And there have been pro-life legislators, maybe well-meaning, but fairly ignorant legislators on this topic that have said things like, well, I don't know, they're just not clear on this. And so now pro-choice people aren't clear on where pro-lifers are. And this has been like not a controversial thing within the pro-life movement. Like, no one in the pro-life movement, or basically no one, has said that women should have to commit suicide via pregnancy if she has a dangerous pregnancy. Like, obviously we don't want dangerous pregnancies to happen, but they do happen. So like tubal pregnancies would be the most common example. If the embryo implants in their fallopian tube instead of the uterus where it belongs, if the baby doesn't die on its own, which it usually does, that's a really dangerous situation. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have a way to save both. We don't have a way to like move the embryo from point A to an artificial womb or her uterus. Like, this is a triage situation now. And so we save as many lives as we can. And typically, we can save the mom's life, and sometimes we can't save the baby's life. And so pro-lifers will quibble on the language here and won't usually want to use the word abortion to describe intervening in the situation. I'm weird in the sense that I don't care so much about that. I don't care what you call something. I care whether it's justified.
Sure.
So you can call it an abortion. That's fine. I'm just going to, like I said, that's a different thing exactly because of what you were talking about. This is a self-defense situation. And I'm also pro you having the right to defend yourself. And so Yeah, I think, and we need to be clear, like every time, I basically think that every time now, if you're pro-life and you summarize your view in like 30 seconds, you need to include at least one sentence just making clear you do, if a woman's life is at risk and we can't save them both, then you do believe that we should save the woman's life and that we should intervene in that situation.
Would you say that in most cases, I think you said this, but is there I don't know if you know the numbers off the top, I don't know how, whatever. Is there a percentage of times where both are able to be saved? Is there a...
So it's really rare. There's been a couple. So ectopic pregnancy is anytime a pregnancy, anytime the embryo implants somewhere not the uterus. And usually it's in the fallopian tube, it's like 90%. There are also occasions where they might implant around the ovaries. There's been a couple of weird cases where the embryo actually ends up more like where the mom's guts are and implants there. And there have been a couple of survivals. Women's bodies are amazing. And basically sometimes the mom's body is sort of like adjusts accordingly. And there have been babies who've implanted like outside the uterine wall, and the mom's body's still been able to provide enough nourishment to the baby that's been able to survive long enough that then they can do a C-section later and save both. It's super rare. Almost every time an ectopic pregnancy happens, the baby is not going to make it, whether it dies on its own naturally or whether it dies as a result of a medical intervention to save the mom.
Okay. So it's more of a triage situation than anything else, and I'll leave that to the medical professionals in the moment. So we know that not only, sure, that's kind of worst case scenario where a mother's life is in jeopardy as a response to a pregnancy, but even apart from life-threatening pregnancies, I think some of the pro-choice argument is that in some way, shape, or form, a pregnancy radically changes a woman's physiology for the rest of her life. And so is not in some sense every pregnancy a threat to life, or at least an implication regarding life?
Yeah, that is one of the most interesting pro-choice arguments that exists. This is like the newest category of pro-choice arguments, and our team spent like 4 years thinking about it before it became as popular as it has lately. But this idea, like basically the idea is that abortion is an act of self-defense because any pregnancy might become dangerous. That's super interesting, right? Like that should make you, if you're pro-life, you should be like, oh, wait a minute, that's interesting. It is interesting. But I think it fails, and there's so much, I could do in an hour on this topic to like really deal with it. I can't. I will point you to, we have like a 30-minute video on our YouTube channel. The audio is in our podcast feed. There's an article version of it just called Refuting Abortion Self-Defense on our blog, if you really want to dig into it. But
we'll make sure you guys have access to that info.
Yeah, but so like just like maybe two quick thoughts to just discover a little bit on this. So one, I'm not convinced by the argument that because sometimes pregnancies can be life-threatening, that means that all of them are sort of inherently this thing where you can do self-defense. Because when we think about self-defense, we're like, almost no one thinks you should be able to defend yourself if there's almost no risk to your life. Like if someone gets road rage and like yells at me because like I cut him off or something, no one thinks I can just like go and like shoot him, because like that, maybe, who knows what would have happened? Like that would be ridiculous. And so the interesting question pro-choice people ask sometimes is like, well, how dangerous does a pregnancy need to be to justify intervening and having an abortion or something that looks like an abortion? Does it have to be 100%? We know she's going to die if you don't. What about 50? What about 49? Like that kind of thing.
Sure.
And my answer is it's got to be at least 1 or 2% risk to your life, because that'd be weird. So in America right now, your chance of dying from pregnancy is not 1%. It's not 0.1%. It's 0.017%. It's actually about 12 times more dangerous to have your appendix removed, where you have a 0.21% mortality rate. Now, the interesting thing that pro-choice people then respond will say, well, America, we've got first world, healthcare and all that, but what about there's other places where it's more dangerous? That's true. So let's talk about the most dangerous country to be pregnant is Ghana. Ghana, you have a 0.31% chance of dying. So it's much riskier, but it's still not even 1%. And so I just don't think that if you have a less than 1% chance of dying, that like this raises to the level of lethal self-defense. As far as the physiology changes, Also, here's like a thought experiment that I think can help on this. Imagine a room with a baby making machine in it. Okay, I'm into philosophy, okay? We do thought experiments, this isn't real. But imagine there's a room with it looks like a Coke machine. It's got a button on it, and it's got a chute at the bottom. If you push the button, you have a very pleasurable experience. But every once in a while, a baby comes out right after. Okay, is everyone tracking? We've simplified pregnancy. Okay, so imagine someone pushes the button hoping that a baby does not come out. They don't want a quiverful or anything like that. They just want the pleasurable experience. But what do you know? A baby does come out. Well, it seems obvious that at that point, you can't just walk away and leave the baby to starve to death. You certainly can't directly kill it by like bashing its brains in or something. Why? Because you pushed the button. You knew what might happen. You engaged in an act that you knew might result in the creation of this inherently vulnerable child that you now have to either care for or transfer that care to someone else. Now, let's modify that idea to bring in this kind of physiological version of the argument. What if the baby comes out the chute, it might be a carrier of, we'll just call it pregnancy disease. In this alternative universe, you can contract a disease where it mirrors pregnancy. You get all the physiological effects of pregnancy. You get nausea, swollen feet, sometimes your stomach ends up looking different later for some reason, like all of the different effects. And so you push the button, baby does come out in this version of the story, and you have 2 minutes to get away from this baby, or else you're going to contract pregnancy disease. And so that means that you can either abandon it, or you can kill it, or you're going to get the pregnancy. I still don't think that you can kill it to avoid it, because again, you knew that this was a possibility. Doesn't mean that I'm saying like it should be illegal to push the button. I'm saying like morally there is that things change when we engage in actions that we know might have these consequences. And then doesn't mean that we can take lethal force against someone to try to avoid those consequences. So much more can be said about this. This is so like surface, but I'll leave it at that because I know there's like a lot of questions.
We do. We have quite a few. But thank you. That helps at least give us a picture. And I love thought experiments. I think that really help us think through scenarios. So again, kind of back to last week. I knew this was a really common argument. I just didn't have time to address it last week. But so if a woman is either involved in an incestual relationship with a member of her family, or if a woman was raped, and in those instances, a pregnancy results. Obviously, she didn't choose this. She didn't make a decision to go back to your.
She didn't push the button.
She didn't push the button.
Yeah.
Somebody forced something on her. Again, this is one of the just kind of very prominent arguments for pro-choice is if a woman becomes pregnant as a result of rape or incest, what do we as pro-lifers then, what is our take on those kind of things? Yeah, so it's really frustrating watching pro-life people respond to this question. I agree.
Because we almost always get it wrong. We almost always either put too much emphasis on the baby. This is like typically what happens. You'll hear people say things like, well, why should we give the child the death penalty for his father's crime? As if that's the motivation of women having abortions. Like, that's not helpful. Or sometimes it's just like, well, let's just talk about compassion and we never talk about abortion. So what I want to do is try to say, like, we should first acknowledge how horrible rape is. Because especially if you're a pro-life dude, pro-choice people don't necessarily know that about you. So if I'm asked about this, I'm going to spend a while just talking about, like, I think rape is one of the worst things that I know about. It's one of the worst things that a human can do to another human. And our society doesn't take this seriously enough. I still hear people say things that implicitly blame the survivor of rape. They'll say things like, well, if she hadn't worn that dress, or if she hadn't been in that part of town, or if she hadn't had that drink. Like, stop, let's blame the guy who raped her. I'm sorry. And then our legal system has issues. There's all kinds of issues. And if she gets pregnant as a result of the rape, then I think she's probably going to have to make the most difficult decision of her life, of either carrying the child to term, so 9 months of pregnancy and a painful delivery, and then either choose to parent the child, which is a very expensive 18-year commitment, or offer the child for adoption, which is a really selfless, loving act, but is painful, emotionally painful for almost every birth mom that goes through it. Or I think she'll make the wrong decision to hire a doctor to kill the baby. So I think he should go to jail for a very, 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 very long time. But part of the reason I'm against rape, or one of the reasons I'm against rape, is because it's this act of violence against an innocent person. And the reason I'm against abortion is because it's an act of violence against an innocent person. So I don't think that we should solve one act of violence by doing another act of violence on another innocent person.
Thank you. I completely agree, and I think you're right. Our justice system has a lot of work to do in the punishment of rapists. Again, it is one of the most horrific things that exists, and yes. I hope that we as pro-lifers will do a much better job at communicating that position. So an argument that I made based on some stuff that I learned from you guys last week was that abortion is primarily a philosophical argument, not a scientific argument. But there is some conflicting data, or at least not conflicting data, but there is a conflicting argument from the pro-choice side that says that prior to the life being a fetus, that as an embryo, that it isn't really human yet. Like we're at that point, it's more kind of that clump of cells that could metastasize into something that's different, very, very much akin to like a virus or some kind of bacteria. Can you help us maybe with the thought process behind whether or not an embryo is or isn't valuable before it's a fetus?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and this is a really good example of how pro-life and pro-choice people miss each other when we use language. So there's a logical fallacy called equivocation, which means when both people are using the same word, but they're defining it differently. And so then we just like accidentally, like we miscommunicate all the times this way. And the word human and human being is one of those, where a lot of times pro-life and pro-choice people mean different things when they say human. So if someone said, well, I think a fetus is human but not an embryo, I would assume probably they mean philosophically, that they mean a valuable human has begun when it becomes a fetus, but it's not a valuable human as an embryo, because scientifically speaking, like it is definitely a member of the same species throughout its entire life. You don't change species membership partially through your life because we don't live in the X-Men universe. Like that's just not it. We don't mutate that fast. And so it's gonna be, as soon as there's an organism, as soon as there's a living organism, then it's gonna be a member of a species. And I don't know how two humans could come together and come up with a non-human that's non-human for like 8 weeks, and then when it becomes a fetus, it becomes a member of our species. Like that's not what happens. But if someone were saying, I don't think it's valuable, then why would it be a more common argument? But then we're in philosophy land, we're not in science land. All science can do is tell us what it is. It's a member of the human species, it's biologically alive, and it's an organism, meaning its parts are working for the good of its whole. It's not like a part of the mom's body, like an organ or something like that. Everything else is in philosophy land. Does it matter? Is it morally valuable? Should we be able to kill it? Like all that stuff, that's philosophy land. You can bring in theology too.
Sure.
But most of the debate at this point is not about the science. Like it was more often in like 70s and 80s, you would hear people say a lot of times no one knows when life begins, and they meant it scientifically. You don't hear that very much anymore just because, I mean, everyone has an ultrasound that they've seen on a fridge at some point. Like it's just harder to make that argument now.
Sure. Cool. Thank you. So I'm just going to kind of plow through questions here. Yeah. None of these are really in order now. We're going to hit some hot topic or some issues.
It's just a hot seat.
Yeah. I told you, you're going to do the heavy lifting today. I just have to ask the questions. So I reached out to a friend and said, look, I know you and I differ on the pro-choice, pro-life thing, and I'd love for you to listen to the sermon from last week, which was heavily your content, like I've said, and just I want some feedback. Like help me ask better questions so that when Josh is here, we can get a clearer from an expert.
I love that you did that. That's so cool.
So they made this argument, and I'm just interested in your take. She said she conceded that our bodies are gifts from God. We read the passage last week in Romans that talks about how our bodies are a temple and that are not our own. Not Romans, it's Corinthians. But she asked this question. She said, if people should have the choice to even harm their bodies in some ways, like with drug use or body modifications or having multiple sexual partners, or any of that kind of stuff, should they not also have the choice to an abortion?
Yeah, so it's definitely true that I think people generally should have bodily autonomy. You should generally be able to choose to do all of those things. We should be able to, I mean, obviously I'm pro getting tattoos. Like it's fine. That's a body modification. I wouldn't want this to be illegal. You can be against it or something, but so all those things that you described, multiple sexual, I definitely think that should be legal. It might not be wise. It might not be God's plan, but it should at least be we shouldn't throw people in jail for that. So when we think about all these different things, it's like it becomes a question for me of like, is this like a wisdom question? Is having multiple sexual partners the most wise thing for your emotional health? Is like an open question, and there can be a moral argument against that even, but clearly it shouldn't be against the law. And so there's some things that it's like you have to really, I think, really be harming someone for us to talk about making it against the law. So when I think about what should be legal and what should be illegal, I'm closer to a libertarian when you start talking about those things. There's a lot of things that are illegal right now that I think should be legal. But even most of my libertarian friends would agree there should be at least 4 laws. There should be they're definitely against murder. I mean, we should protect innocent people from being harmed by people who are stronger than them or whatever. We should have laws against rape. They would all agree on that. There should be laws against assault and battery. And most of my libertarian friends are pretty big property rights guys. Be against theft, right? But they'll at least those things should be against the law, and that makes sense. So that's why I think a lot of things should be legal that you could do with your bodies, but I don't think it should be legal to greatly harm or kill another person. It's a different thing to me than body modification, drug use, things like that.
Okay, so just different argument, and then
yeah.
All right. I'm going to skip down just for the sake of time because there was a you mentioned legal and law.
Yeah.
And so that automatically makes my mind go to the recent decision, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And my friend addressed in her email specifically the Roe v. Wade decision and the implications that we have on the backside of being a post-Roe world now.
Yeah.
And so I just want to read a quote. And if we can kind of maybe dissect it a little bit, it's a little bit lengthy, so I'm going to read it just so we have the full context of what she was saying. She said this. She said, "My personal issue with Roe v. Wade overturn was not so much the abortion aspect, but the loss of bodily autonomy for me, my sisters, and daughters. If the movement wasn't so rooted in the dirty word of abortion, I think many people would have an easier time thinking of pro-choice as having a choice over one's body, which everyone has, and almost everyone exercises to some degree. People choose to eat a vegan diet or a carnivore diet, both with very different reactions in the body. People choose to drink energy drinks despite the consequences of heart damage. My wife will weigh out of that because she gives me grief about drinking energy drinks. People choose to be vaccinated or not, both with varying outcomes. People choose to smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol. Mm-hmm. People choose to give their boy child a circumcision or not, way before the child is self-aware. Both offering varying outcomes. Saying my body, my choice is not pro-murder, it's pro-autonomy. And I just don't think that there should be issues with that whatsoever. So I think there's kind of a root argument here.
Yeah.
And it's this. If the movement wasn't so rooted in abortion, I think many people would have an easier time thinking of pro-choice as having a choice over one's body, which everyone has and almost everyone exercises to some degree. Can you give us a take on?
I mean, I think I sort of agree with that, but I think that's removing clarity instead of adding clarity. So I'm opposed to capital punishment. But I could say people would be, I could imagine a pro-capital punishment person saying, well, people would be more pro-capital punishment if we just talked about it as being an anti-crime thing and we stopped talking about what happens in an execution. Be like, well, yeah, that's probably true, but I think we should grapple with the hardest, most uncomfortable parts of our own worldview. The idea that abortion should be against the law in the case of rape and incest is one of the most uncomfortable parts of my view, but I should grapple with that. And so, sure, I think people would be all for, generally speaking, my body, my choice, if we don't talk about what abortion is, because generally speaking, we're all pretty pro-bodily autonomy, just with some exceptions.
Sure, I think you just covered that a moment ago when we talked about things like tattoos and the way that we eat and all that kind of stuff. I think those are body autonomy, and those are rights that we should have.
You mentioned cigarettes, you mentioned alcohol, those are clearly pragmatic, wisdom kind of questions. The vaccines thing, most people don't think that people should be forced to get vaccines, and I'm in that camp too. I think people have to decide and make a conscious choice of whether or not they're going to get the vaccine. I think the most interesting part of that was at the end, where she talked about male circumcision.
Yeah,
because
let's address that.
That's closer, because you are doing that to a baby that is not yet self-aware, and that is a permanent change. And frankly, I'm still trying to figure out what I should think about circumcision, but I am on the trajectory I'm on is starting to become opposed to it.
Okay.
As someone who has circumcised my 3 sons, back before I was sort of on the track that I'm on, but that is a permanent change that they're doing to someone. I understand the cultural and kind of religious stuff that was going on in the Old Testament. I'm not convinced that applies now. So I'm not convinced that we should be able to do that. I don't know that we should make it illegal, because I think like female circumcision, which is a nice way of saying female genital mutilation, FGM, that should clearly be illegal. But I think that's like what might be going on there is there's a threshold of how much harm you're doing, and once you're doing a certain level of harm, it should be against the law. And clearly, the ramifications of FGM are much higher and are clearly past that line. But I am open to an argument that male circumcision, although much less harmful, still might be over that line, and maybe that should. I'm open to that argument.
I appreciate that position. I've heard you say this in some of the talks that I watched on YouTube. That you kind of hold everything on a spectrum of confidence.
Oh yeah, and
there's
almost nothing I'm very confident in my positions on.
So I think it's good to leave room to say, I'm not decided here yet, and it is a really compelling argument and a good thing. I'd welcome the conversation maybe between the 3 of us, because I'd like to hear the answers as well. Yeah. So last week, just to kind of close us out, we're close to time. Yeah. I talked about how it's important for us to follow the entire trajectory of our conclusions to an extreme. Yeah. That what is true at one place must always be true, even at its extreme, in order for it to be true wherever it is. Is there a place that you can maybe help us where pro-life people are failing to follow the trajectory of our conclusions, particularly related around the idea of like end of life decisions? So let's say that my wife hates that I ride a motorcycle, but I do. I love it. It's one of the most fun things I do standing up. And so
it's a wisdom question.
It is. So if I end up in a motorcycle wreck, yeah, right, and I'm deathly injured, no brain activity, and machines are keeping me alive. Yeah. At that point, is it? If we're talking about equal rights to life, I'm still a human. Right. I'm still alive, scientifically. Right. Should we spend hundreds and thousands and millions of dollars to keep me alive via machine for the rest of however long I can live? No, I don't think we're obligated. I don't think we're obligated. Just the fact that we have the technology to keep your heart pumping means that we're obligated to do that. I think it's fine. The Catholic Church even agrees on this, to let nature take its course. That it's okay to unplug and let what would be happening if we didn't have that technology happen. I don't think that's an inconsistency. It's just very different than an embryo or in a human fetus. Are just not in that situation. And so I don't think it's comparable. I think areas where pro-lifers sometimes don't follow their views to their logical conclusion would be, for example, so like a lot of pro-lifers do have a rape and incest exception. They don't think it should be illegal to have abortion in the case because we feel so much compassion, which I do too. But then I've seen pro-choice people jump on that person and be like, hey, I thought you were pro-life because you believe that it's a person from conception. Like, how can you make it like, well, you're saying that it's not a person if it's the result of rape? Like, they will jump on that kind of obvious inconsistency. So I think like areas like that are kind of like obvious areas where sometimes pro-life people have parts of their view that make them uncomfortable and they don't want to follow it to their natural conclusion. Okay. Are there any other instances you can think of where we fail to make good arguments, or just kind of give you carte blanche here for just a minute or two? Like, is there anything that you would just share? Like, you said you listened to my sermon. Mm-hmm. Anything that I missed, or anything that for any of us who hold a pro-life position would need to hear from you in just a minute or two? Yeah. So I'll say pro-life people this is the hardest year to be pro-life in at least 30. This is a rough
There's the level of tribalism and disunity in our culture that was already there before the Dobbs decision. It's only increased since. And so like that's what's so hard for me is to just look at a society that I've spent my life trying to bring people who disagree about different things to come together and sit like this and have a conversation like Starbucks or something. And we're more divided now than at least we have been in my lifetime. And so I would just encourage pro-life people to try, here's what I would say. Here's a challenge for pro-life people. We would do a better job of connecting with the outsiders that is talked about in Colossians 4, 5 through 6, if we were more careful with the media that we took in. So both sides, almost everyone is engaged in some level of confirmation bias, where we have a position or maybe an area on the political spectrum that we land on, and then we just listen to our side. Sure. This is so when leftists only listen to Rachel Maddow or MSNBC, they're doing that. But pro-lifers or conservatives, because not all pro-lifers are conservative, but conservatives who only listen to Fox News and Ben Shapiro are doing the same thing. And then sadly, a lot of times the people that we're listening to on either side are training us every day to think of the other side as stupid at best or like morally bad or the enemy at worst. And we need to stop it. We are hurting our souls we listen to that stuff a lot more than we listen to the Bible. And that is bad. The fact that we are more affected by like what Donald Trump says than what the Bible says is crazy and is not helping. So my challenge to pro-life or to conservatives a lot of time is don't listen to people who you like to listen to, but they make you feel good. They make you feel like we're the hero, they're the bad guys, because then when you see them, that's in your head. We need to really change like the kind of information. We should be listening to both sides and trying to figure out what makes both sense. And sometimes people on the other side have a really good argument, and sometimes they're right. And we won't discover that unless we're listening to not dumb people on both, not the memes, but like the smart people on both sides. If everyone did that, our society would get so much more healthy.
Yeah. No more theology from TikTok, I think is what Josh is saying. All right, let's just stop. All right. Well, thank you, Josh. Man, thank you so much for being here with us today. Me. And I'll say this for us as a whole as a church. I know we had a series designed around big questions and real answers, but you need to know the position of myself and the rest of your pastors is we always welcome questions. What we do up here, when I'm preaching, as a matter of fact, we're getting ready to go away in just under a month and look at the things that we feel like our church needs to hear for the next year. And we're gonna come up with a schedule and a plan for what sermons we want to preach. And we're always asking the question, what do the people who call Fusion City Church need to hear? What do we need to put in their toolbox to help them go outside of these doors and make an impact in the city or the places where they live, work, and play? Like so that every man, woman, and child has an opportunity that they come in contact with them. Like, how are their lives going to be positively impacted by their relationship with somebody from Fusion? We're asking those questions. And if you have questions that you don't feel like you have the answer to, we want to know so that we can address them biblically, relationally, so that we all grow to like the water. We want all the boats in the harbor to rise together. And that only happens when we're having the same conversations. I think connect groups are a huge part of that. Right? When you come in here on the morning, it's me with a microphone and a Bible talking to you. I want to have some conversations with you, and you need to be having conversations with your small group. So if you're not in a connect group, we're going to encourage you to get in one. Keep asking your questions. We want to hear from you. We are never unreachable. We are never like just like these guys that can't be touched. We don't even have a secretary unless you count Chris. Like we don't have anybody you have to go through to get to us. Like you can walk into the office, ask your question. We'll spend a week talking about it and come back and tell you what we came up with, or we'll have the conversation right there. We want your questions. We want to invest into your life with anything that God has given us to be able to share with you. We want to share that freely. You have uninhibited access to us. Please ask your questions so that we can all grow. When you ask questions, I get better. Like just approaching the topic of abortion, like led me to a conversation with Josh, to just the information to other, like I've been a huge consumer of information over the last 3 weeks because we were going to talk about a question that people had. And so please ask your questions so that we can all grow together. I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to dismiss you guys. Let's pray together.